it was kind of two things. Number one, writing Our Women in Moscow really, redirected me toward the Cold War as such a fertile subject for fiction. I think that the ground has been well covered, certainly, at the time by, the sort of the great spy fiction novelists, but those were mostly sort of British men writing in mid-century. And I read a lot of John le Carré and certainly loved his art and many of the stories, but I sort of got to sort of my fourth one. And it was just getting a little boring to me how it wasn't so, there was, misogyny, you expect this in mid-century fiction. And as a woman, you just sort of like, okay, yeah, this is happening, fine, but it was it was almost this kind of dismissal of women that was taking place. They just didn't take them seriously. And I found that a little boring, number one. But number two, I thought, well, this is, this is actually an opportunity. And the thing that had struck in my mind, about Melinda McLean was, when this is the real life wife of Donald McLean, when he, just sort of defected when things got too hot and he defected to Moscow with Guy Burgess, famously, she knew what was going on the whole time. But when, Monday morning came and they're like, so how come Don hasn't turned up to work? And she's like, oh yeah, I have no idea. He just went on a little trip with his friend and I'm sure he'll be back, and she just played them like a violin. And she's, she couldn't go with him. She was sort of 8.5 months pregnant at the time. But, you're just looking at the statement she's making to the press and to MI5 and you're like, wow, and they just completely never for a second doubted her, because like she's a pregnant housewife. Like, of course, she's got nothing to do with this, right? So I was like, well, there's an opportunity there. And so I thought, just kind of reimagining. And by the way, there were several, many women are actually pretty good at the whole living a double life thing, because that's kind of what we do. We have a persona we project to the world that is sometimes very different from what we're experiencing internally. We're very good at that. And, so I was pursuing, every time I found a really good Cold War spy book, I'd be reading it. And so then I'd find a story in the news, and one story particularly kind of caught my attention. This happened in the UK back in the 1960s. And this young woman, I think she's about 15 years old at the time. And a couple moved in a few houses down in her sort of London suburb. And the housewife, who was married to this guy, was very friendly, borrowed a cup of sugar, that kind of thing, struck up a friendship with this girl and her mother, and really actually went so far as, this girl was sort of confiding in this woman a bit and felt like, how she's at that age where, sometimes it's easier to talk to sort of a maternal aunt type figure instead of her own mother about things. It was that kind of relationship, very mentor-mentee type relationship. And then MI5 turns up on the doorstep and says, so we need to use your house as a listening post because we're pretty sure that this couple that moved in down the street is actually, a radio operators for the Soviet Union, and they're broadcasting like sensitive classified information. So they actually, so got the girl and her mother to like wear wires and essentially trap this woman into getting the evidence they needed to arrest and convict her. And of course, the girl was very conflicted about this because first there's this betrayal, like, oh my God, this woman was lying to me the whole time. But on the other hand, now she's betraying the woman, by tricking her into, getting this information that MI5 needs. So it was very, it was one of those, and then years later, she's obviously very conflicted about this, and it's one of those things that sticks with her. So many years later, she goes to visit this woman in prison because the woman was convicted as a spy and sent to prison, and she goes to sort of get closure and to feel forgiven. But instead, the woman is like, I will never forgive you for the betrayal, of me and my cause and everything. And she's like, oh, so I'm getting closure, but not in the way I thought I was going to get closure here. Like I was definitely right to put this woman in jail. And so, but I thought that was just a fascinating story. First, that sort of before and after, I usually have a dual timeline, and sometimes it's someone in the past and someone in the present, or in the later on. But sometimes I like to have two characters at two different points in their life, because I feel like these experiences we have such a lasting impact. And what is that closure process? And so this was one of those books where I was like, okay, we have this great coming of age story, and there's a spy involved, but there's all this, coming of age stuff going on there as well. And then comes back later to sort of deal with the trauma of what happened. I love that setup. But then comes the other side of it, where my editor was like, so we feel like your books sell better when they are set in New England summer settings, and we can market them as summer books. So that's like the practical side of publishing. And I do, obviously, it's not like I'm dragged unwillingly to write about New England summer. It's certainly, and I thought, actually, these two pieces work well together, because in that New England summer setting, we can have a Soviet radio operator hiding in plain sight, living a double life, befriending a girl. And so that was really how those two pieces came together. And I just returned to the setting of The Summer Wives, which was commercially my most successful book. Winthrop Island, I thought, would be a great setting to place this drama, because of its cultural and social characteristics and its geographical position right there at the edge of Long Island Sound. Winthrop Island is somewhat loosely, actually not so loosely, inspired by the real life Fisher's Island in Long Island Sound, which is a very, I think what the phrase that's been coined lately, I think in relation to, it came out from sort of Succession, but stealth wealth. This is very stealth wealth, very quiet, The first rule about Fisher's Island is we don't talk about Fisher's Island. And in fact, you can't actually stay overnight there. There's no hotel. And there's hardly any restaurants. There's the club. There's actually two different clubs. And there's this sort of 2/3 of the island is private. It's sort of a private association. So there's a few rentals available, but it's mostly houses that are handed down generation to generation among families. So it's hard to actually get real information about this. There's few occasional articles that come out every so often, but I get this culture because I've sort of been living and as an anthropology major, been living around the periphery of it for so long that it's, as a culture, it fascinates me. I mean, I could go there on a day trip, but you then have to go back home. So it's not a place where I can logistically go and write, but I have been a few times, just absorbing the natural environment. I want to be careful writing about Fisher's Island and not make it too close to the original. It needs to be my own place, or I feel a bit creatively hemmed in by the facts, of the island. I was like, well, I can't do that because there is no house that exists there, or there is no little inlet there, or there is no, the lobster boats actually go somewhere else. So I needed to have my own geography, but it is loosely inspired, and the general shape of the island and configuration is the same. And so for me, it's just easier to not be too close to it when I'm writing, so I don't feel as if my imagination has to be kind of constricted to the actual facts on the ground. And Miranda does belong to my Schuyler family. She's on the family tree there. But I wanted to have that connection to my previous books, but also make it a book where you didn't need to know anybody. I try to write all my books so you don't need to have read any of them before picking one up. But I definitely had a sense when I wrote The Summer Wives, I'm like, well, if someone is going to just pick up my book this summer, I don't want them to feel like they're stepping into a whole situation that they can't, that there's, like when you walk into someone else's family reunion and you don't know what's going on and who's who. So she was a member of that family, so that my previous readers would be like, oh, so she's the cousin of so-and-so, without there being, any sense for a new reader that, oh, there's all this stuff I have to catch up on in order to understand what's going on here. I don't write it the way you read it. I write each narrative in its entirety. And I always write the one that happens first, where the mystery is embedded. Because I need to know what happened in order to understand my character's starting point. when that second narrative begins. And apparently I'm weird. Apparently most writers write it, in that, and you could argue which one is more linear. I mean, I feel like I'm the more linear because I have to write this thing beginning to end and then turn to the other one and write that one beginning to end, and, and weave them in. But for me, that's what works, because I think it's partly just my own personal narrative technique. It, to me, makes the most sense and is much more easy to write if I write certainly up to the kind of the crisis moment where I know how it ends, but I'm not quite sure how to get there. And because I just need to know where my characters are psychologically when I start that second narrative. And this is, of course, we're talking about books where I have the same character at two different points in time, but the same is true when I have two different characters in different points in time, because I kind of need to know what is that character's family backstory that I'm dealing with when my later character then starts her own story. So I need to know that so that I can I guess write it the most effectively, so that everything's revealed at exactly the right moment. Beach at Summerleys is coming out end of June. We have a new, Willa Guyton Williams #5 will be out in, according to the latest estimates, September of 2024. And in the meantime, we'll have another book out that I, again, can't speak about. I've turned it in. We're in revisions right now. And that one will be out next summer. And the only thing I can say about that is that a large chunk of that book is actually contemporary, and it's on Winthrop Island in the modern day.